In the days after the confrontation, the Mediterranean Sea grew quiet again, but the silence was deceiving. Beneath it, ripples of outrage, grief, and defiance began to spread across continents. The survivors of the flotilla raid, many bruised and exhausted, were deported back to their home countries. Yet even as they stepped off planes into the glare of reporters' cameras, their spirits seemed unbroken. They spoke not of defeat, but of purpose. One of them, a middle-aged volunteer from Norway, stood before the crowd and said, "We went to bring hope, and they met us with weapons. But hope cannot be seized at gunpoint." Her words were shared millions of times across social media, fueling anger, solidarity, and questions the world could no longer ignore. In Istanbul, Athens, London, and New York, people poured into the streets. They held banners showing images of the seized ships, their decks stained with chaos. They chanted for freedom, for Gaza, for the end of a blockade that had turned human life into a daily struggle. At the heart of these protests were not politicians or celebrities, but the families of the flotilla crew, the mothers, fathers, siblings, and children who refused to let their loved ones' mission fade into history's shadows. For them, this wasn't just a political act. It was deeply personal. Every photograph, every headline, every echo of gunfire from that night was a wound that wouldn't close. They carried portraits of those who had sailed, some missing, some detained, and demanded accountability. They set out with medicine, not weapons, one father said, his voice trembling with restrained rage. And yet, they were treated like criminals. Meanwhile, inside Israel, the debate raged on. Government officials defended the operation, calling it a necessary act of defense against potential threats. Military spokespeople released footage of soldiers being attacked with makeshift weapons on board, insisting that force had been justified. But critics within Israel, too, began to question whether the cost of that night was worth the image it projected to the world. A powerful state, armed and unyielding, confronting ships that carried aid and activists instead of armies. In Gaza, word of the raid spread quickly. Families waiting by the coast for the flotilla's arrival watched news broadcasts in disbelief. For them, that convoy represented more than supplies. It was a symbol of connection to a world that often seemed to have forgotten them. When the ships were seized, it felt like the sea itself had turned its back. Yet even in the sorrow, there was gratitude. Gratitude for those who risked everything to reach them. Weeks later, pieces of the flotilla, battered life jackets, flags, fragments of wood began washing ashore. Fishermen found them tangled in their nets, small remnants of a much larger story. Some were collected and kept as tokens of remembrance. Others were displayed in exhibitions across Europe, where artists turned tragedy into expression, a reminder of courage met by conflict. And still, the story grew. The United Nations called for an independent investigation. International legal bodies debated the legality of the blockade. Diplomats spoke in calm tones about de-escalation, and it began in the early hours of dawn. The sea was calm, the waves gentle, but beneath that stillness, tension brewed like a storm waiting to break. On the horizon, ships carrying humanitarian aid and activists sailed toward Gaza, determined, hopeful, and defiant. Their mission was simple yet controversial: to break through the blockade and deliver supplies directly to the people of Gaza. But as the flotilla approached, a shadow loomed across the water: the Israeli Navy. Moments before sunrise, communication went silent. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, had issued repeated warnings demanding the ships change course and dock at an Israeli port for inspection. The flotilla refused. They insisted their mission was peaceful, their cargo transparent, their intent purely humanitarian. But in the complex and volatile politics of the region, nothing is ever that simple. From above, helicopters circled. On deck, activists linked arms, chanting for peace and justice. The first flash of light came from a flare, a signal perhaps, or a warning. Then silence broke. Ropes descended from the sky, and within seconds, IDF soldiers touched down on the ship's decks. What began as a symbolic voyage turned into a tense confrontation. Shouts echoed, confusion spread, and the chaos of the sea turned into a theater of resistance and force. Eyewitnesses recall the fear, the shouting in multiple languages, the rush of boots, the clash between soldiers and unarmed volunteers. Some raised their hands. Others tried to shield themselves. The IDF later stated they had no choice but to intervene, claiming the blockade was necessary for national security, a measure to prevent weapons from reaching militant groups in Gaza. The activists, on the other hand, called it an act of aggression, a violation of international law, and a brutal response to a mission of compassion. Within hours, the world reacted. News outlets from every continent aired footage of soldiers boarding the vessels, activists being restrained, and aid supplies scattered across the decks. Governments demanded explanations. Protests erupted in major cities. To some, the flotilla represented courage, ordinary people standing up against injustice. To others, it was provocation, a political act cloaked in the language of peace. The detained crew members were taken to Israeli ports for questioning. Their cargo, medical kits, food, and construction materials, was inspected, photographed, and stored. The IDF released statements defending their actions, insisting that Gaza's aid needs could be met through established, secure channels. But for many around the world, that explanation only deepened the anger. In the days that followed, the story grew larger than the event itself. It became a symbol of blockade and defiance, of control and desperation, of two peoples locked in a cycle that seems impossible to break. Families of the activists demanded their release. Human rights groups condemned the raid. The flotilla's name became a rallying cry at protests across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And yet, amid the uproar, one question lingered in the salty air of the Mediterranean. How did a mission of peace end in confrontation? Was it inevitable, the clash between humanitarian intent and military control? Or was it a tragic failure of diplomacy and understanding? As the ships were towed away, battered but not broken, the image of the IDF soldiers boarding the vessels remained etched in the world's memory, a moment that captured the complexity of the Gaza conflict in one dramatic scene. For those who sailed, it was never just about aid. It was about freedom, the right to move, to deliver, to reach those cut off from the world. And for those who stopped them, it was about protection, the duty to secure borders and prevent threats. Between those two truths lies the human tragedy that continues to unfold. The sea, once calm, carried the echoes of that morning, the voices, the cries, the sound of helicopters fading into the distance. The flotilla may have been stopped, but its message sailed far beyond the blockade. It reminded the world that even in the face of force, hope still finds a way to float.